teach us how to write and how to do math. We go into our areas of industry and practice, but nobody ever teaches you how to overcome moments of disability or losses of loved ones or, global pandemics. Nobody teaches us how to do this kind of emotional maneuvering. I also want to talk a little bit about the main causes of mental health conditions. And again, when I say mental health conditions, I'm talking about things that are unmanaged. So unmanaged stress, anxiety, depression, feelings of chronic worry. So a couple of reasons why folks develop mental health conditions are as follows. First, some people are just born with genetic predispositions. If there's a family history of psychiatric conditions or mental health conditions, some people are born with genetic predispositions for blooming of those conditions later on in life. We also look to irregularities or dysregulation in biochemical levels. And in English, that just means that if your brain is producing irregular biochemicals, that certainly could have an impact on whether an individual develops a mental health condition or not. In addition, adverse life experiences, for example, trauma experiences, high stress events that are unchanging can lead to mental health conditions as well. Clearly with the pandemic, we're seeing just a global condition that to a very large degree is not changing. And so many people, millions and millions of people actually are feeling disempowered and feeling as though their conditions are not changing, because for some people, they're really not. And so for that large segment of the population, we're really seeing a predisposition for developing mental health conditions if some remediation or some amelioration is not sought or experienced here in the near future, which is why these kinds of conversations are so important to keep those kinds of social issues on the radar. Additionally, we find that the use of alcohol and drugs can often be correlated with the manifestation of mental health conditions during a person's life factors. And lastly, contextual factors such as social isolation, major life changes such as loss of loved ones, loss of jobs, loss of relationships, loss of homes. All of those complex circumstances can lead to people feeling psychologically and emotionally unbalanced. If not rebalanced, we then see that there could be a predisposition for developing a mental health condition down the line, such as depression and things of that nature. So, but and it's interesting because in my practice, I often hear people say, but don't we all get sad? I mean, isn't sad a thing that everybody goes through? And my response is, yes, of course, feeling sad is a natural part of life. But what we do with that sadness can look very different for some people. And the level of sad can also be different for people. So generally, if we're faced with a life crisis that we don't know how to overcome, and those conditions are unchanging, we sort of elevate the emotional bar so that we're not just simply sad anymore. Right now, we're really at risk for grief, and we're really at risk for suffering. And those concepts are very, very different than the episodic sadness that we feel like, I didn't have my favorite ice cream at the restaurant, I'm sad, I mean, we all have those types of experiences pretty regularly that stem from generalized disappointments in life. But when it comes to grief and systemic and chronic suffering, those are very different constructs. So in my practice, I've had people come talk to me because their spouse has left them for another partner. I've had folks talk to me about being newly disabled. I was able-bodied and then I was in a car accident and now I'm completely disabled. What do I do? I've had people question me regarding, how to move on after the loss of a child, after the loss of a parent. I've worked with people that are dying, that are actively dying, and what do I do? People that have been diagnosed with terminal illnesses that truly have exhausted all medical measures. I've also worked with people in federal correction facilities that will never come up for parole. And so in my experience, I've worked with a diversity of people who truly have just had to manage some of these conditions that some of us can never even imagine. And I've learned a great deal from these people that have entrusted me with some of the most intimate parts of their lives. For things I encourage people to do when they come to me, after they've come to me and they've said, Elizabeth, my child just died, or they say to me, I've lost my home and I don't know what to do. I've had this conversation with people, like I said, that are in detention that will never come up for parole. And I feel like what I'm about to say has been helpful to those people that I just mentioned, and hopefully it'll help some of you. So the first thing I would encourage anybody going through an emotional crisis like the ones I just described is just give yourself permission to acknowledge the experience. It's okay to say, what I'm going through is terrible and I'm freaking out right now. It's okay to cry and get upset. It's okay to completely lose it and just be human. It's okay to do that. And I'd argue that acknowledging your emotional experience is a necessary requisite. You cannot get to step 2 if you don't do step 1. And a lot of people, unfortunately, avoid step 1. They don't want to talk about it. I'm fine. Loved ones check in, they reject. And it's understandable. Nobody wants to talk about the hard stuff, right? We all want to have a good time, but the reality is hard stuff comes for us all. So what do we do when it's our turn? And again, so the first, piece of advice that I'd have for people is to just, 1, give yourself permission to acknowledge the experience. We cannot resolve dilemmas that we ignore. So it's important to acknowledge our feelings and our experiences as we're having them, and either write them down. If you're not comfortable talking about your experiences with somebody, that's okay. I'd encourage you to, like I said, write it in a journal, or take a note on your phone, but find some way to externalize and manifest what it is that you're feeling. The second step that will help develop emotional harmony is to just give yourself permission to have the experience. So it's not sufficient to just identify what the experience is. My experience has taught me that in addition to identifying, you have to give yourself permission to have the experience without judgment. I can't tell you the number of times people have broken down in my office when I used to practice. I don't have a whole lot of time to practice these days, but when I used to practice, I had just, a large group of people that would come into my office and they would cry and they would apologize. They'd say, I'm so sorry, I'm crying. I'm like, why are you apologizing for being human? You're going through something terrible. It's okay to cry. I can't tell you how many times people said, I'm sorry, I'm being weak right now. And I had to reflect and say, you're not being weak. You're just going through a really hard time, and it's okay to cry. It's okay to say, I'm upset. So, first piece of advice is acknowledge the experience that you're having. Second piece of advice would be to give yourself permission to have the experience without shaming yourself, without getting mad at yourself, or without excusing your experience. You do yourself a great honor by validating what you're feeling. Subsequent to that, in step 3, I'd encourage people to try to seek the other side of the experience. And this is the hard part, actually. Well, step 1 and 2 were pretty hard too, but step 3, in my experience, is the most challenging part, because this part is not natural. So in step 3, we begin to seek the other side of the experience. And here's what I mean by that. In step 3, we begin to slowly, gently begin to get empowered again about our situation that has left us disempowered. If I'm driving in my car and I am in an accident and I wake up in an ER and I'm completely disabled, I'm going to feel disempowered. And that's okay, right? It's okay to feel disempowered, because to a very large degree, I am. So in step 3, I begin to slowly and gently become re-empowered, but in a different way. And in step 3, I begin to ask myself, what else is going on here? What else is happening in this experience? In addition to the grief, in addition to the pain, in addition to all the horrible things, because they are all there, I just acknowledged them and gave myself permission to have those experiences. What else is happening here? And again, step 2 and step 3 are not immediate. Sometimes we got to grieve for a couple of days. Sometimes we've got to grieve for a couple of weeks before we can even begin to acknowledge that there might be something else going on besides or in addition to our grief and loss. We ask ourselves, what else is happening here besides the grief, besides the tragedy? Is something else happening here too, in addition to that? We seek opportunities. Are there any opportunities in this change that's occurred in my life? In the 4th step and last step, I would encourage people to practice adaptive strategies. And the adaptive strategies should really be focused on patience, self-compassion, and self-care. I'm using big keywords here. But they're important because in order to really transition into healing and into gaining meaning and value from some of these traumatic life crises, we do have to be patient with ourselves, patience with the process of healing and change. We have to be self-compassionate, giving ourselves permission to just transition from the way life was before and the way life is going to be now. And we do have to engage a lot of self-care. And what is self-care? Self-care is simply a series of practices that we engage to keep ourselves well, healthy, and whole. I'm incredibly close to my father. He is my role model, my hero. He's been my biggest supporter from day one. I consider any degree of success I've had to him, and so he's been such a prominent figure in my life. My father was diagnosed with cancer, unfortunately, last year, and it really came as a shock. I'm not a very emotional person. I'm very logical and pragmatic, and I think through things. So I remember I was getting ready that morning. My mom called me and she said, "I got to tell you something." I was like, "Well, say it, woman. I'm running late to like 30,000 meetings. I got all these things to do." And she said, your dad's been diagnosed with cancer. And I heard her. But of course, I'm a very, on the go kind of person. So I heard her and I kind of immediately jumped to, problem solving, because I problem solve for a living. So I said, "Mommy's going to be fine. We're going to get him hooked up with the best doctors. Everything's going to be okay. We got to do this. We got to call this person. We got to do this." And I kind of came up with a game plan. And I said, "All right, I got to go. I'm going to call you later." So I hang up and I'm, continuing to get ready. And then a couple of minutes later, I think just the monstrosity of that news just kind of hit me. And I felt all of the emotions. And for somebody who was not highly emotional, to get that much emotion at the same time, to sort of be avalanched by that, was, to say the least, incredibly uncomfortable. But I remember that I just had to completely lose it. And I did. I lost it completely. I was, I even get a little emotional thinking about it and just talking about it. But I was in my bathroom and I literally couldn't stand. I just kind of sat down on the floor and put my hands in my face, my face in my hands, and just was just bawling. And I'm usually the person that problem solves for other people. I in my line of work and in my position, I don't get to be wrong a lot. I always have to have the answer. I've got to be right. And I have very little wiggle room, to make mistakes. And so in that moment, I felt really alone, even though I wasn't. I have a lot of friends and family, but I felt really alone. And I remember just going into the steps, because that's, I know to do that. So I was like, okay, fine. I'm completely freaking out. It's totally okay. Well, the situation is not okay. I actually don't know if the situation will be okay, but this will eventually settle. And I cried. And I was really stuck in this sad place for for a couple of weeks actually. And I think it was one of the few times in my life that I've been stuck in a negative emotion for weeks. I usually bounce back up pretty quickly. But as the weeks were wearing on, I remember trying to force myself into step 3, like asking myself, what else is happening here? Is there an opportunity? And I remember thinking time and time again, no, there's no opportunity. It's all bad. It's all just terrible. And I'd start crying again. And so I would just acknowledge, okay, I'm not there yet. I'm not ready for step 3. I just got to just breathe this a little bit more. But progressively, every couple of days, I would ask myself, is there something else going on? And weeks went by, and weeks later, I had a new thought emerge that I hadn't had before, and it just wasn't the time, so it hadn't emerged just yet. But progressively asking myself that question, is there anything else going on here? At some point, I had a new thought, and the thought was, well, he's still here. He's not gone yet, and you have him, so, you should do something in addition to crying. And so I did. When I had that thought, and it was the first time I had like a clear thought in the weeks that I'd been grieving. I rescheduled my work commitments. I intentionally began taking more time off of work and spending more time with him. I intentionally designed this great birthday party in Puerto Rico, and I said, we're going to have a blast. We're going to bring cancer with us. We're not going to stop living. And it was such an emotional time, and we had a great time, and we cried, and we were freaked out, and we had cake for my birthday all on the same day. So in the morning, we were all crying because he's there with his machines and his medication, and we're all, terrified. And then we, like I said, later in the evening had cake. So, we were able to find some balance there, but it was very, very challenging. Ultimately, as the months wore on and his health fluctuated and my emotional responses fluctuated, I emerged from that situation changed, because that's what crises do. They change you. I certainly suffered and certainly grieved and certainly was one of the lowest points in my life. But I also later, much later, months later, way later, when I had more emotional and psychological clarity, I was able to gain true gifts and meaning and value from that really hard time in my life. I actually became more focused in the way I was living, and I became more focused in, intentionally creating additional opportunities for me to be with my family. I even redesigned my own personal relationships. I, made personal decisions about being not as focused on work as I had been, and maybe being a little bit more focused on my personal relationships and giving myself opportunities that historically I had not. And even made a decision to find, new opportunities and create, sort of redesign my life. I, as a result of that, made a decision to allow for life partnership, true life partnership to come into my life. And, very recently I was married, and I do wonder, would I be married today if I didn't go through that crisis? The reality is I don't know. But so I look back on that time, and it was one of the worst times in my life. And using that 4-step model really helped me kind of work through that really horrible time and helped me gain meaning and value. But again, it took a long time. I was just cognizant and present with the steps and with every phase of my own grief and change process. Emotional harmony is something that can be achieved, and it can be sustained over long periods of time, but it can occur in a realistic fashion. So, and I always tell people, the pendulum of life swings up and down for us all. We all have our high moments. We all have our low moments. We know we have achieved emotional harmony if we are actually enjoying our lives, if we are working through life's challenges smoothly, not quickly, but smoothly and in a healthy manner. But we also should consider that emotional harmony is dynamic and it evolves. So just because my life is harmonious today doesn't mean that tomorrow I'm not going to have a tragedy. I might, but if I consistently practice these 4 steps, with time, and again, a lot of practice, my own experience has shown that it's easier to buoy ourselves back up into emotional harmony after we've experienced emotional crises.